According to Jonathan Haber, in Critical Thinking, Aristotle is the first great critical thinker because he categorized and organized his thoughts about the world in the context of what other thinkers thought. Now, I hear you barking, big dog, and you're right. This kind of thinking was going on long before Aristotle. In India, Asia, and other parts of the world, people were definitely thinking about biology, politics, drama, logic, and rhetoric, and many, many categories like Aristotle was doing. And this kind of categorical thinking definitely served what Haber calls the building blocks of education. Category is literally like little cells that you can link together to help think. Well, this is essentially what Kierkegaard meant when he said leap of faith. It wasn't just leap of faith in the sense that it sounds like, but literally when you are going from category to category or building block to building block in educating yourself, you're taking a leap that there actually is some substance in the category you are going into. So the question is, why do we still constantly hear people referring to Aristotle as the first? Well, in Taking Back Philosophy, Brian Van Norden thinks that part of the problem is ethnocentrism and even anti-intellectualism. People literally saying philosophy X because he's from my country and philosopher Y based on uncritical assessments, and it's just basically favoritism. And I think Van Norden is on to something in this book, but I also think he comes at it a little bit strong. And, I dig his passion and his call to think more critically about the history of philosophy and why we have these endless cliches over and over and over again, like Alfred North Whitehead suggesting that all of philosophy is but a footnote to Plato. And there we can actually do a little critical thinking of our own. Like, how many of us have actually read where it was that Whitehead wrote that? It is true that Whitehead could have easily said all of philosophy is a footnote to Adi Shankaracharya or to Buddha or to Confucius, etc. But is there maybe some context that we haven't read because we're not using critical thinking skills that helps prompt us to not just take quotes and make them this big, massive truth statement asset, when in fact, if we knew the context, we might know more about what was meant, how it was meant, why it was meant. So instead of hysterically accusing Whitehead and other people of creating problems, we can defer judgment and actually do some research. And maybe we'll find that we should judge Whitehead for making all of philosophy a footnote to Plato. Or maybe we'll look at a map and we'll do something different than Van Norden and we'll say Aristotle. Ancient Greece, sure, but who says ancient Greece is the West anyway and not the East? I mean, when you think about it, what does a pin on a map have to do with the value of the ideas anyway? Whether they're produced by Joe, Jolene, or Jack in Juniper or Jasper or wherever it may be that they may be creating their ideas. I don't know the answer to these things, but asking questions like these are just part of the reasons why critical thinking is so important, and there's more coming today. So smash that thumbs up if you like putting the brakes on in your mind so you can consider things more fully, and get subscribed if you're new here because we are going deep today, and we'll be going even deeper in my upcoming live cohort course called Beyond Sherlock. If you're interested, well, later I've got something very special and exclusive for you, a critical thinking tutorial, but it's only for people who are interested in receiving advance notice of when this special program goes live, Beyond Sherlock. It's called How to Think. It has 22 powerful critical thinking practices you can follow. But first, even if it is problematic for Haber, Whitehead, other philosophers to constantly focus on Plato, Aristotle as being the first thinkers, I think it's really important that we look at Haber's larger point. He's saying that thinking is about building blocks, and some of those blocks we use to build critical concepts about the world, and these are categories, categorical thinking. And Aristotle really did do a lot in that realm. And the more of these building blocks you have, the more you can think through and arrive at better conclusions about issues. So what are some of these building blocks? Well, one of them is understanding probability and likelihood. So it's sometimes good, but all too often a very bad thing that so much of human history has involved guessing. People literally had no way of knowing what the weather would be like tomorrow, let alone make predictions about the stock market or what we're going to invest in terms of scientific research and so on. And in today's world, I think we ignore just how much we get to learn about thinking probabilistically, and then we don't double down on it. We don't dive deeper into it than we should. And that means that we lead ourselves into traps that we could avoid. So one way of thinking about probabilistic thinking and its value is traps like golden handcuffs or its alternative, slave's luck. And I know some people have said, Anthony, you shouldn't use those terms. They're so negative. But I think they're very apt terms. They're basically alternatives to the old phrase, selling your soul to the devil, but with a modern twist. So to give you a concrete example of golden handcuffs, it happens when someone goes to medical school to please their parents instead of themselves. And then they wind up getting a great salary despite wishing that they could be a painter for a living, even if the art world is hard and the risk of living in poverty is high if you want to be an artist. But since the doctor has gotten through medical school, set up a practice, and the doctor's spouse really likes having a doctor's income, those golden handcuffs feel even tighter. And that's a trap, one that could have been avoided with more probabilistic thinking at a younger age. If I make this sacrifice to make other people happy now, how likely is it that I'm going to be trapped and miserable later and have sunk cost fallacy, which means that I've invested so much into this that I can't see a way out of these wonderful golden handcuffs, so I just tighten them onto my own wrists even tighter and increase my own misery. So this is a very, very key reason why critical thinking is so important, and the sooner you start using it, the better. Now, our next tool might sound obvious, but how often do you strategically use comparison and contrast? I mean, we do it daily all the time. Eating a ripe orange is better than eating a rotten one. We can compare and contrast fresh versus rot quite easily, and you know how to do that sort of thing. But critical thinking is best when you strategically use comparison and contrast. And a cool way to do this with problems that you want to solve is to use an alphabetical memory wheel. So a memory wheel is literally just the alphabet in a circle, and you may have a number of circles embedded one in the other with a number of alphabetical wheels. So for example, let's say you're trying to solve a problem. Instead of coming up with nothing or scratching your head and struggling to generate ideas, the memory wheel enables a thing called ars combinatoria, or the art of combination. And so let's say on your outer wheel, you have A to Z, and you just ask, what would Aristotle say about this problem? Now, your first point of contrast and comparison is between you and Aristotle. But then you go deeper into the wheel to the second circle, and you just change it, maybe to another A, like Adi Shankaracharya, or you spin that wheel over to K for Kristeva, and then you have another point of comparison. How does your thoughts compare to Aristotle's thoughts compared against Kristeva's thoughts, or Adi Shankaracharya's thoughts? Of course, all of this assumes this use of the memory wheel, that your bookshelves are filled with books by the greatest thinkers of history and our contemporary era, and you're actually reading those books and memorizing their most important details. You are reading and memorizing the greatest thinkers, aren't you? Oh, well, good, because it makes it easier to use the next tool, which is knowing and using definitions. So in a book called Critical Thinking, Robert Ennis offered the Frisco model to help define critical thinking and help you notice how to basically rack and stack an acronym in a memory palace or on a memory wheel that is quite useful. So Frisco is focus, which means identifying, defining the focus or central concern, and then using reason to identify and judge the acceptability of the different data points that you've already collected as part of your focus and defining step. Then you have inference, which is to judge the quality of what you're assuming your different data points to be in terms of acceptability. And you're going to make many inferences. And, inferences have weaknesses, but nonetheless, you gather as many as you can. Then the S in Frisco is situation. You pay close attention to your mind as you go through the situation and the broader situation and all the data points that you can make inferences about. Then you have clarity, which is to check again that those definitions are clear, that every little bit of language is as clear as possible in your thinking process. Then you do an overview and you step back and look at everything as a whole. So rack and stack Frisco in a memory palace, or as a shout out to channel member John Eric, he reminds us that if you're a welder, you can use a term and you can burn the ideas into a memory palace. Burn it in, fuse it in, as he put it. I really like that. That's another way of thinking about it. And when it comes to Frisco, there's a reason why Ennis would burn in and fuse in, looking deeply at the focus that you have and the words that determine what you're going to focus on, how you're going to think about what you're focusing on. Because the exact meaning of words is something very important. It's a slippery fish. There's a thing called polysemy, which is that words don't just mean one thing. They often mean several things. And not only that, they can mean several things in your own mind, but they almost certainly will mean other things than you intend in the minds of others. So, you got to mean what you say and say what you mean, and it really helps to look at the polysemy of things. So you got to throw back to compare and contrast. The power of defining your terms is always improved by seeing the possible tension in the possible multiple meanings or polysemy in just about every word. As one of my fave underground philosophers, Jeffrey Klempner, says, in one of my favorite realms of critical thinking, known as ontology, we are looking to define what the is. I know that can be a little weird if you're hearing it for the first time, but when we are trying to define what problems are, it literally is that. We want to be as clear as possible about what the is. And if you haven't read his Philosophizer trilogy, get on it, because he goes deeper into working through what the is. Now, the next tool of critical thinking is making sure that you have more stuff to think about. That means if you go through Frisco or you otherwise come up with amazing revelations, you got to start putting those ideas into action. Why? Well, because you need data. You need to be able to have reflective thinking on what was produced by your revelations when you put them into action. You see, there's a horrible disease out there. If you've had this disease, you might know that you have gotten caught into analysis paralysis. And that means just constantly being in a loop of looking at the same thing over and over and over again without actually implementing on it. And too many people fall into this disease. But it's not really the fault of critical thinking. It maybe is coming from a lack of implementation or courage to implement, or fear about what's going to happen when you implement because of maybe some control freakism. And here, as a reader of other critical thinkers, you have to be really careful, because there are all kinds of people who come up with conclusions, but they don't actually personally put those conclusions into action. And that means they don't reflect on the consequences of what their beautiful little brains cooked up. And since the people these thinkers are talking to also haven't had a chance to use comparison or contrast and really dial down on what the is, the problem they're trying to solve, well, they wind up taking action based on a dearth of experience. And when that happens, we wind up stuck analyzing failure instead of success, because the advice we followed came from people who never actually analyzed the results, because they never produced the results in the first place. So when you're reading philosophers, when you're reading people who analyze society and make recommendations, you've got to be very, very careful, because there's a lot of stuff out there that just simply hasn't been tested, and the people who are giving those recommendations often have no consequence if it goes wrong for you. So the good news is that if you can understand what I'm saying now, you have the cognitive capacity to take much better action on conclusions and think through probabilistically how likely it is for the advice of someone who apparently has never actually put those ideas into action is going to work for you. And that comparison and contrast, well, I would focus on that like your life depended on it, because it does. One of the things that we do when we take advice is we essentially sacrifice part of our lives to the advice itself. and by extension to the person giving it. So do everything that we've discussed so far, and soon you'll start being able to make fewer mistakes and get more value out of the advice that you do follow. And as you take action and reflect, you're going to get what's sometimes called metacognition, or the ability to perceive the nature of your own thoughts. Now, some people worry when they start taking action and thinking about the actions that they take that they're going to get into another form of analysis paralysis, and that's a legit worry. But monitoring your thinking process is possible without losing perception. So you don't have to fear it so long as you continue to take action and you take action on the information that is revealed when you analyze the consequences of the actions that you've taken. Keeping in mind that the more probabilistic thinking that you do, the less likely that you're going to take action on things that aren't going to produce a result. So you don't have to worry about getting lost in the weeds of complexity and becoming just like one of those sneery advisors who are all talk and no action. But let's call a spade a spade. It can happen. All the more reason to dig deeper into complexity by applying the conclusions you come up with in everyday life and then analyzing what happened so that you can get metacognition, literally starting to think about how you think and then think about how you think about the thinking that is needed in order to draw more conclusions from the results of the actions that you've taken. So one way that this plays out in my own life is that I practice a form of critical thinking meditation that's based out of an ancient practice called Advaita Vedanta. And I wouldn't call myself a Vedantin or anything like that. I've modified it and so forth. But basically, one of the powerful things about this practice is it splits your mental activity between what's called Atma Vikarya and Loka Vikarya, which is the difference between self-inquiry and inquiry into what appears to be an existence outside of the self. It almost certainly is an existence outside of the self, but that's the point, is you question it. Is there anything outside of myself? Is there anything that is not somehow connected to my well-being and vice versa? So Vikarya can also be translated as remembering. So in Atma Vikarya, it's self-remembering, and in Loka Vikarya, it's remembering the events of the outside world and doing this as basically trying to resolve yourself into what's called non-duality, or not thinking that you're somehow separate from the larger processes that are going on in the world. And as a daily practice in meditation, it leads to better pattern recognition, both of how the individual mind ticks and how other minds tick and how larger bodies like institutions operate. And really the name of the game is to try to keep your ego low and use comparison and contrast to see how the inner world and the outer world can resolve so that you don't have ego conflicts and you can avoid issues like groupthink. Now, without this practice, I think I'd be still a very sick puppy indeed. And I have to tell you, I avoided getting into this practice for way too long because I was that guy who was willing to advise myself and others to stay away from practices like this because I had only thought about them and I'd made conclusions about them without ever taking action on them. And thank goodness I used critical thinking to make the change, and I used a combination of everything that we talked about today to make sure that as much as possible, I'm not that guy ever again. And you know, it's tempting, and sometimes you fall off the horse. I certainly do. But nonetheless, I think this is one of the best things that critical thinking can do for you, is to make sure that you reserve your judgments and conclusions until you've actually implemented and taken action, and then studied the consequences of the action from lived experience. So if you also want to avoid being that person who is constantly judging things that you haven't tried, it's just part of what we'll be talking about in Beyond Sherlock, a new live cohort course. It's based on the art of memory combined with critical thinking, and not just critical thinking, but the kind of critical thinking I used to teach during the 4 years I taught a fourth-year university course on critical thinking. And you'll learn a bunch of things I've learned about logic and thinking better over the years since. Material that would probably take forever and a day to find, and without memory will slip like sand through the forgetting function of your mind. So that's why I use the magnetic memory method to remember all kinds of things about critical thinking processes, tactics, techniques, and strategies. And if you want to get advance notice, I'll be sending you my private training just to thank you for raising your hand that you're interested. It's called How to Think. It's a super detailed audio training, and you'll want to take notes and think yourself about what I'm saying there and take action on some of the steps that I'm suggesting. And if you want that, go to magneticmarymethod.com/BY for beyond, and you'll get all the details and claim this special resource at magneticmarymethod.com/BY. Now, do you want to know what I feel is the most important and most beneficial reason we all need to be critical thinkers? It's this. When you're a critical thinker, you're never alone. That's right. Loneliness disappears completely because you have joined a group of people who care about the truth, but also the truth about the truth, and the ways that you can arrive at being in tension with what that is. Not ever settling on a hard and fast conclusion, but being part of the adventure of truth as a thing that is coming into being at the same time you are, not separate from you, but as part of you. And that's what memory is in so many ways. It is the process or set of processes in which you come into being, and you have an awareness of coming into being with truth itself. Not only that, when you use the memory wheel technique I talked about today, you always have a host of thinkers on auto dial. You are never alone. You don't have to be. You have all the resources you need. Now, of course, it's not the same as actually getting to talk to somebody, but it's a tactic that exercises your memory, it exercises your critical faculties, and it prompts you to take action. Action that will actually probabilistically get you a positive result. And you know, because those thinkers, they took action themselves, even if it's only the action of writing books. And if you can scan those books probabilistically and think about how likely it is that they took the actions that they're advising you on as opposed to just writing books about them, well, look, you're going to have a much better outcome, and all thanks to critical thinking, rather than just constantly blabbing out opinions because you've got them, right? We humans are wired to move. That's why we have so much blah, blah, blah in the world. But there's also the opportunity to not do anything at all, which is something that we also get trapped in. Stasis conceals the glory of the truth, but action reveals, even if sometimes that revelation is painful, because truth, aletheia in ancient Greek, as Heidegger says, means unhiding. And that revelation can sometimes unsettle you a little bit. But nonetheless, take action, take time to think about the actions you take, and you will have a much better mental state much more frequently, because that's ultimately what the success of action is all about. Diminution of the bad and glorious repetition of the good, which can truly keep getting better and better and better and better still as you explore the nature of exactly what the is.